Today's story is about the extremely well-documented events surrounding the world's first attempt to modify a hurricane. And at the end, I've got a special surprise for you, because you're also going to learn about the most amazing coincidence, one that I guarantee you do not want to miss. In fact, this entire story is mind-boggling, but it's true. The first attempt to modify a hurricane was called Operation Cirrus, and it took place over 77 years ago, way back in 1947, as a joint operation between the US military, the US Weather Bureau, and a very powerful American company called General Electric. Now, for those of you unfamiliar with General Electric, GE is an American company which at one time had many profitable divisions, including healthcare, a finance division, as well as energy and aerospace divisions. In fact, up until 2005, GE was considered the world's largest corporation, worth well over $500 billion. Though today, after numerous financial scandals and high-level mismanagement, it doesn't even register among the top 50. But at one time, GE employed some of the world's top scientists, working in some of the finest laboratories in the world, in many, many different fields. And one of those scientists happened to be GE meteorologist Dr. Vincent Schaefer, who in 1946, 1 year before Operation Cirrus took place, conducted the first successful cloud seeding on a very natural, everyday cloud by airplane in the Berkshire Mountains in Massachusetts, which resulted in not only a significant amount of snowfall, but also a great deal of debate among both scientists and the public about whether or not we should be tampering with Mother Nature. So, early in the afternoon on October 13, 1947, from Mobile, Alabama, the cloud seeding experiment began, as two large B-17 bombers and a lone B-29 Superfortress lifted from the runway into a bright, clear southern sky. The airplane crews, the pilots, and the scientists inside, they were all extremely eager, as they've been kept on the ground for the past couple of days, waiting for a slow, weak hurricane system named Hurricane King to cross and leave the southern tip of the state of Florida on a northeastern angle before finally heading out to sea. The scientists figured that now would be the perfect time for them to conduct their experiments, as the storm was no longer over land and therefore shouldn't pose any threat to anyone after they completed the research. Which, as you're about to learn, is just another example of how there's nothing more dangerous than an expert, or in this case a group of them, who figure they can't be wrong. Hello. For as long as I can remember, I've been fascinated by weird events that seem impossible but are true. And that's what this channel is all about, bringing strange, unbelievable stories to you once a week. So if you're a fan of the mysterious, the inexplicable, the unbelievable, but true, subscribe, give me a like, hit the notification button, and I promise, with every new video, I'll do my best to keep blowing your mind. The lead B-17 bomber's mission was to fly just above the top of the hurricane clouds. It was designated as the Cedar, so its cargo bay was loaded with large pieces of dry ice and an ice crusher, needed to break down the chunks before they could be dropped into the clouds from the open bomb bay doors in its belly. The second B-17's job was to follow closely behind, but about 3,000 feet higher, as its mission was to view and record any instant changes in the clouds right after the first bomber seeded them. The third plane, the Superfortress, it was the control aircraft. Its mission, while also to monitor any changes in the hurricane as it was being seeded, was at the same time to direct the flight paths and oversee all operations of the other two planes. Also, it too carried a full load of dry ice, which it would be using to seed some of the smaller clouds along the edge of the storm, to see what effect it might have there. And as planned, everything seemed to go perfectly smooth. On the first run, the bomber seeding the hurricane, it dumped most of its load directly into the storm on a straight path for about a 100-mile stretch. Then afterwards, along with the other two planes, it rose, banked, then backtracked down its previous flight path to document exactly what effects the ice seemed to be having. Then, all three planes did two more ice dumps into the top of a very large cumulus cloud, which afterwards they all circled to watch for changes. Now, The first thing all of them noticed right away after the first seeding was that the bottom of the hurricane, or the deck as they called it, began to break up quickly, becoming smaller and wispier. And then, after the second dump, they all documented that the top began to grow again, becoming larger. Satisfied, but now out of ice and low on fuel, they returned to the base to look closely at the data they collected so far and to draw initial conclusions. The next day, all of the scientists couldn't wait to return to the remnants of Hurricane King to examine the effects their experiments had made upon it. However, when they flew along the storm's predicted path back to where it should have been, it wasn't there. Somehow, the storm had moved. And it was only after hunting for it for quite some time in wider and ever wider circles that they finally relocated it in the eye of the hurricane, almost 100 miles west of where it was supposed to be. To their astonishment, Hurricane King had made a 135-degree turn to the left. And on top of that, it wasn't a weak storm system anymore. It had strengthened. And hurricanes aren't supposed to be able to do that once they've left land and are back over the sea. And also, most concerning, the much bigger hurricane was now barreling down in a straight line to Savannah, Georgia, and South Carolina. Unbelievably, a new, more powerful storm was on its way back to strike land again for the second time. And 2 days later, it did, causing over $34 million in damages to the two states, which today would be almost $500 million, as well as taking the life of one unfortunate person who got caught up in the storm's massive surge. When the public learned of the weather modification experiments that had been carried out on a weak Hurricane King after it left Florida, they quickly concluded that this was why the storm had strengthened and returned to strike again. And they were understandably outraged, threatening lawsuits against both the federal government, the military, and GE. So, Dr. Francis Reichelderfer, chief of the Weather Bureau, he immediately appointed 3 of his top weathermen to find a case where a hurricane that hadn't been seeded had followed a similar track. He wanted to be able to show that at least once before, a hurricane had swerved the same way King did. And guess what? They announced they'd found one. And then very quickly, they made sure to publish all of their findings, immediately evaporating all threats of further lawsuits. But guess what? There was a fly in the ointment. Because Dr. Irving Langmuir, head of GE's laboratories and one of the project managers for Operation Cirrus, he'd already issued a statement that he was 100% sure the storm had changed course due to the seeding. And so the damage had already been done. The people became furious once again. And correctly gauging that there was no further interest or stomach in weather modification, the public was assured that going forward, all projects into cloud seeding were going to be shelved. In fact, for years, no scientist would even dare to mention the word modification and hurricane in the same sentence. Then, in 1962, the public learned that they'd been lied to, and that the National Hurricane Research Project hadn't stopped experimenting on hurricanes. After it was disclosed that they'd silently carried out at least one more test in 1958. And the only reason they did disclose it was because they had to, when the US Weather Bureau and the Department of Defense, under Project Storm Fury, announced they were going to begin seeding hurricanes again, but now using silver iodide instead of dry ice. And this Project Storm Fury, did you know that it ran from 1962 all the way up to 1983, experimenting on hurricane seeding for over 21 years? Can you imagine how much information they had to have collected over that amount of time? And how much better they have to be today at manipulating a storm? And oh yeah, the coincidence I said I'd tell you about. Amazingly, the secret seeding test the National Hurricane Research Project admitted to in 1962 that had taken place on a hurricane in 1958 happens to be the exact same year that a massive hurricane struck the exact same places in North Carolina, South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia as Hurricane Helene did this year on September 17. And these two hurricanes, the one in 58 and Helene, to the exact same day they took place 66 years apart. And oh yeah, the one in 1958, It also was named Helene.